Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 2, Chapter 22, The Ruin of the Balkans. The Christian states of the Balkans were the children of oppression and revolt. For 400 years they had dwelt under the yoke of the Turkish conqueror. They had recovered their freedom after cruel struggles only during the last 100 years. Their national characteristics were marked by these hard experiences. Their constitutions and dynasties resulted from them. Their populations were poor, fierce, and proud. Their governments were divided from one another by irreconcilable ambitions and jealousies. Every one of them at some ancient period in its history had been the head of a considerable empire in these regions, and though Serbian and Bulgarian splendor had been of brief duration compared to the glories of Greece, each looked back to this period of greatness as marking the measure of its historic rights. All therefore simultaneously considered themselves entitled to the ownership of territories which they had in bygone centuries possessed only in succession. All, therefore, were plunged in convulsive quarrels and intrigues. It is to this cause that their indescribable sufferings have been mainly and primarily due. It was not easy for all or any of these small states to lift themselves out of this dismal and dangerous quagmire or find a firm foothold on which to stand. Behind the national communities, themselves acting and reacting upon each other in confusion, there were in each country party and political divisions and feuds proficient to shake a powerful empire. Every Balkan statesman had to thread his way to power in his own country through complications, dangers, and surprising transformations, more violent, more intense than those which the domestic affairs of great nations reveal. He arrived hampered by his past and pursued by foes and jealousies, and thus harassed and weakened, had to cope with the ever-shifting combinations of Balkan politics, as these in turn were influenced by the immense convulsions of the Great War. In addition to all this came the policy of the three great Allied powers. France and Russia had each its own interests and outlook, its favorite Balkan state and its favorite party in each state. Great Britain had a vague desire to see them all united, and a lofty impartiality and detachment scarcely less baffling. To this were superadded the distracting influences of the various sovereigns and their Teutonic origins or relations. In consequence, the situation was so chaotic and unstable, there were so many vehement points of view rising and falling, that British, French, and Russian statesmen never succeeded in devising any firm, comprehensive policy. On the contrary, by their isolated, half-hearted, and often contradictory interventions, they contributed that culminating element of disorder which led every one of these small states successively to the most hideous forms of ruin. Yet all the time the main interests of the three great allies and of the four Balkan kingdoms were identical, and all could have been protected and advanced by a single and simple policy. The ambitions of every one of the Balkan states could have been satisfied at the expense of the Turkish and Austrian empires. There was enough for all, and more than enough. The interests of the three great allies was to range the Balkan states against these empires. United among themselves, the Balkan states were safe. Joined to the three allies, they could not fail to gain the territories they coveted. The addition of the United Balkan States to the forces of the Entente must have involved the downfall of Austria and Turkey and the speedy, victorious termination of the war. For everyone there was a definite price. For Romania, Transylvania. For Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Croatia, Dalmatia, and the Banat of Temesvar, for Bulgaria, Adrianople and the Enos Media line, for Greece, Smyrna and its hinterland, and for all, safety, wealth, and power. To realize these advantages, certain concessions had to be made by the Balkan states among themselves. Romania could restore the Dobruja to Bulgaria. Serbia could liberate the Bulgarian districts of Macedonia. Greece could give Kavala as a makeweight. And as an immediate solatium to Greece, there was Cyprus, which could have been thrown into the scale. As the final levers, there were the financial resources of Great Britain and whatever military and naval forces the Entente might decide to employ in this theatre. It is astonishing that, when all interests were the same, when so many powerful means of leverage and stimulus were at hand, everything should without exception have gone amiss. If in February 1915, or possibly after the Turkish declaration of war in November 1914, the British, French, and Russian governments could have agreed upon a common policy in the Balkans, and had sent plenipotentiaries of the highest order to the Balkan Peninsula to negotiate on a clear, firm basis with each and all of these states, a uniform, coherent action could have been devised and enforced with measureless benefits to all concerned. Instead, the situation was dealt with by partial expedients suggested by the rapid and baffling procession of events. Everything was vainly offered or done by the Allies successively and tardily, which done all at once and in good time would have achieved the result. The Balkan states offered by far the greatest possibility open to Allied diplomacy at the beginning of 1915. This was never envisaged and planned as if it were the great battle which indeed it was. Fitful, sporadic, half-hearted, changeable, unrelated expedients were all that the statesmen of Russia, France, and Britain were able to employ. Nor is it right for public opinion in these countries to condemn the Balkan states and Balkan politicians or sovereigns too sweepingly. The hesitations of the King of Romania, the craft of King Ferdinand, the shifts and evasions of King Constantine all rose from the baffling nature of the Balkan problem and the lack of policy of the Allies. Serbia indeed fought on desperately and blindly without considering for any other interests but her own, and with frightful consequences to herself, ultimately repaired only by the final victory. Romania was throughout in peril of her life and perplexed to the foundations of her being. When at last, after infinite hesitations, bargainings, and precautions, she entered the war, she was too late to decide or abridge the struggle, but in good time to be torn in pieces. Bulgaria turned traitor alike to her past and to her future, and after many exertions was plunged in the woe of the vanquished. Greece, rescued in the nick of time by courage and genius, and emerging with little cost upon the side of the victors, survived incorrigible to squander all that she had gained. Yet in Romania there was Take Ionescu, always pointing clear and true. In Bulgaria, Stamboliski, braving the wrath of King Ferdinand and marching proudly to his long prison with the names of England and Russia on his lips. And in Greece, Venizelos, threading his way through indescribable embarrassments and triumphing over unimaginable difficulties, preserved his country for a time in spite of herself, and might well have limited the miseries of Europe. August 1915 saw the culmination of the Russian disasters. By the end of June, the German-Austrian offensive had driven the Russians out of nearly all the southern half of their huge Galician-Polish salient. This had been reduced to a semicircle 170 miles across, with Brest-Litovsk at its center and Warsaw almost on its outer circumference. Lemberg had been lost. Mackensen's front was now faced almost north, and ahead of him lay the 4 railway lines which fed the salient. On July 13 he commenced, with a German and 2 Austrian armies, an advance against the southernmost railway, the Kowel-Cholm-Lublin-Ivangorod line, with Field Marshal Worisch on his left pressing eastward. By August 1 he was across the railway in the center at Cholm and Lublin, and 4 days later Ivangorod and Warsaw were evacuated by the Russians. Novogeorgievsk, where some 85,000 second-class troops had been collected, made a show of defense, but capitulated on the 20th. But this was not the end of the disasters. In the north, in Lithuania, the German 8th and 10th armies under Hindenburg, reinforced by German troops from the south, where the line had been shortened, moved forward, and on August 10 had taken Kovno. All the Russian troops between Kovno and Riga were thus in danger of envelopment and fell back. Even Brest-Litovsk, the long-vaunted model fortress, did not hold out long. Invested on August 11 on 3 sides, it was abandoned on the 26th after the forts on the southwest front had been stormed. Thus the last semblance of the great salient had disappeared, and the Russian front, except for a forward bend covering Riga, had approximated to a north and south line. The Russians had evaded envelopment and capture, but all their gains in Galicia had gone. They had lost Poland, 325,000 prisoners and more than 3,000 guns, besides rifles and equipment which it was impossible to replace. Worse than all, the Tsar was induced to remove the Grand Duke Nicholas from his command and send him to the Caucasus. The Russian defeats from April onwards had reacted most unfortunately against Italy. In 1914 Austria could spare no more than local corps to watch the Italian frontier. By the date of the Italian declaration of war she had managed to collect 122 battalions, 10 squadrons and 216 guns against Italy, disposed in mixed groups behind carefully constructed entrenchments. But henceforward there was a constant flow of reinforcements from the Galician theatre. The Italian offensive towards Trieste, known as the First and Second Battles of the Isonzo, in June and July, carried the Italians 6 miles into enemy territory, and thereafter left them as firmly rooted in trench warfare as the armies on the Western Front. The Italian operations in the Tyrol led to no more than the occupation of 5 small separate salients of Austrian territory. Thus to the Russian disasters was added the Italian deadlock, and both exercised a fatal influence upon the Bulgarian mind. Nevertheless, all eyes in the Balkans were riveted on the Gallipoli Peninsula, until the result of the Battle of Suvla Bay became known. Till it was lost, the Bulgarians held their hand, and in the month of July there were still hopeful possibilities of bringing them in on the side of the Allies. The Austro-German attack upon Serbia, which had seemed so imminent in February, had not matured during all the months of the summer. The deep anxieties with which some members of the cabinet viewed this great danger were happily not borne out as the months slipped away. I know of no cause for the delay of this attack other than the influence exercised upon the Balkan states and upon Bulgaria by the operations at the Dardanelles, and the belief so widely held throughout the Balkan states that England would never relinquish such an effort without achieving success. The continued fighting on the Gallipoli Peninsula, the knowledge that large reinforcements were pouring out, and that another great trial of strength in that theatre was impending, dominated the action of Bulgaria. And the action of Bulgaria was the fact which in turn governed the Austro-German attack on Serbia. I was, as has been shown, strongly of opinion during the month of July that we ought not to stake the whole Balkan policy solely on the result of a battle in Gallipoli, but that, while doing everything in our power to secure a victory there, we should also strive to win Bulgaria. This could be done only by territorial concessions forced upon Greece and Serbia, combined with the granting of loans and the expectation of success in the Dardanelles. The imminent peril in which Serbia stood and the restricted conditions under which the Allies could afford her protection made it indispensable that she should cede and, if necessary, be made to surrender the uncontested zone in Macedonia to the Bulgarians, to whom it belonged by race, by history, by treaty, and, until it was taken from them in the Second Balkan War, by conquest. Serbia, even when at the last gasp during the first Austrian attack upon her in 1914, had found it necessary to keep large numbers of troops in the Bulgarian districts of Macedonia to hold down the native population. Right and reason, the claims of justice, and the most imperious calls of necessity alike counseled the Serbians to surrender at least the uncontested zone. To the ordinary exhortations of diplomacy were added special appeals by the sovereigns and the rulers of the allied countries. The Prince Regent of Serbia was besought by the Tsar, by the President of the French Republic, and by King George V to make a concession right in itself, necessary in the common cause, vital to the safety of Serbia. But to all these appeals the Serbian government and parliament proved obdurate. The Allied diplomacy moving ponderously forward, every telegram and measure having to be agreed to by all the other parties to the alliance, had just reached the point of refusing any further supplies of stores or money to Serbia unless she complied with their insistent demand when the final invasion began. The same sort of thing happened about Kavala. Monsieur Venizelos, with his almost unerring judgment of great issues, was prepared to imperil his whole personal popularity in Greece and place himself at a deadly disadvantage in his controversies with the king by intimating his readiness to acquiesce in the cession to Bulgaria of Kavala in certain circumstances. Had the Allies been able to secure for Bulgaria the immediate cession of the uncontested zone in Macedonia and the port of Kavala, it seems very probable that they might have been induced during the month of July to come to our aid and to march on Adrianople. It seems certain that, even if this full result had not been obtained, the tangible cession of this territory to Bulgaria at the instance of the Allies would have made it impossible for King Ferdinand to carry his country into the hostile camp. Monsieur Radoslavov gave in brutally frank language a perfectly truthful account of the Bulgarian position in these months. No effective measures were however taken, and all was left to the hazard of the battle on the Gallipoli Peninsula. It would be unjust not to recognize at the same time the extraordinary difficulties with which Sir Edward Grey was confronted owing to the need of combining the diplomatic action of 4 separate great powers in so delicate and painful a business as virtually coercing a then friendly Greece and an allied and suffering Serbia, specially shielded by Russia, to make territorial concessions deeply repugnant to them. Although a united diplomacy might have assisted, nothing less than a decisive victory at the Dardanelles could at this time have counteracted in the Balkans the terrible tide of Russian defeat. By the end of the third week in August, all prospects of an immediate victory at this vital point had vanished. When our failure was fully appreciated by the competent military personages at Sofia, the Bulgarian king and government finally made up their minds to join Germany. From that moment, the ruin of Serbia was certain and irremediable. The quaking dike of the Dardanelles campaign, that had so long held off the deluge, had yielded at last. It was henceforth only a question of the timetables of Austro-German troop movements. Serbia, however, though fully conscious of her danger, remained recalcitrant to all appeals to make effective concessions. Till the last moment she kept her heel on the conquered Bulgarian districts of Macedonia, and maintained a stubborn front to the overwhelming forces that were gathering against her. A new tremendous event was now to strike across this darkening situation. At a conference held at Calais early in July, the representatives of the cabinet, that is, the Prime Minister, Lord Kitchener, and Mr. Balfour, had, in accordance with the convictions of the overwhelming majority of their colleagues, argued against a further Anglo-French offensive in the West in 1915. They had proposed that the Allied operations in France and Flanders should be confined to what was described as an offensive-defensive, or, to speak more accurately, an active defensive. The French had agreed. General Joffre had agreed. The agreement was open and formal, and it was on this basis that we had looked forward and prepared for the new battle on the Gallipoli Peninsula. No sooner, however, had General Joffre left the conference, notwithstanding these agreements, he had calmly resumed the development of his plans for his great attack in Champagne, in which he confidentially expected to break the German lines and roll them back. It was not until after the Battle of Suvla Bay had been finally lost, and we were more deeply committed in the peninsula than ever before, that we became aware of this. To avoid unnecessary circulation of secret documents, it had been arranged that members of the War Committee, wishing to lead the daily War Office telegrams, could do so each morning at the War Office in Lord Kitchener's ante-room. It was my practice to read every word every day. On the morning of August 21 I was thus engaged when the private secretary informed me that Lord Kitchener, who had just returned from the French headquarters, wished to see me. I entered his room and found him standing with his back to the light. He looked at me sideways, with a very odd expression on his face. I saw he had some disclosure of importance to make, and waited. After appreciable hesitation he told me that he had agreed with the French to a great offensive in France. I said at once that there was no chance of success. He said the scale would be greater than anything ever before conceived. If it succeeded, it would restore everything, including, of course, the Dardanelles. He had an air of suppressed excitement, like a man who has taken a great decision of terrible uncertainty and is about to put it into execution. He was of course bracing himself for the announcement he had to make that morning to the War Committee and to the Cabinet. I continued unconvinced. It was then 11 o'clock, and he drove me across in his car to Downing Street. The committee assembled. Lord Kitchener had no doubt apprised the Prime Minister beforehand, and he was immediately invited to make his statement. He told us that owing to the situation in Russia, he could no longer maintain the attitude which was agreed upon in conjunction with the French at Calais, that is, that a real serious offensive on a large scale in the West should be postponed until the Allies were ready. As he put it to us, he had himself urged upon General Joffre the adoption of the offensive. In view of the fact that, as we now know, the French plans and preparations had long been in progress, had indeed never been interrupted, this must have been a work of supererogation. I immediately protested against departure from the decisions of the cabinet maturely made and endorsed by the Calais Conference, and against an operation that could only lead to useless slaughter on a gigantic scale. I pointed out that we had neither the ammunition nor the superiority in men necessary to warrant such an assault on the enemy's fortified line, that it could not take place in time effectively to relieve Russia, that it would not prevent the Germans from pursuing their initiative in theatres other than the West, and that it would rupture fatally our plans for opening the Dardanelles. The following record has been preserved of these remarks. Mr. Churchill expressed his regret at such a course. The German forces on the Western Front had not been reduced and were some 2 million against the Allies 2,500,000. This amounted to a superiority for the Allies of 5 to 4, which was inadequate for the offensive. Since our last offensive effort, our relative strength had not altered, while the German defences had been strengthened. It seemed to him that, in the hope of relieving Russia, and to gratify our great and natural desire to do so, the Allies might throw away 200,000 or 300,000 lives and much ammunition. Footnote. Obviously, this should read men, meaning men killed and wounded, that is, casualties. End of footnote. And might possibly gain a little ground. The attack on May 9, Fastubert-Arras, had been a failure, and the line had not been altered by it. After an expenditure of lives and ammunition in this way by us, the Germans would have a chance worth seizing, and it would be worth their while to bring back great forces from the east. A superiority of 2 to 1 was laid down as necessary to attack, and we, the Allies, had not got it. These views were not seriously disputed, but it was urged that the French would move in any case, and that if we did not march too, the alliance would be destroyed. Lord Kitchener was careful not to hold out any expectation of a decisive success, and when pressed to define a decisive success, he accepted my expression, a fundamental strategic alteration of the line. There is, he said, a great deal of truth in what Mr. Churchill has said, but unfortunately we have to make war as we must and not as we should like to. I besought the Cabinet, which followed the War Council an hour later, not to yield to the French impatience without a further conference at which all the arguments could be stated and a final appeal made. I was strongly supported by others. I was forced to admit that if the French, after hearing what we had to say, still persisted in their intention, we should of course have to conform. But I urged that a last effort should be made to avert the vast, futile and disastrous slaughter that was now impending. Sir John French, who was in London, was interrogated by the Cabinet. He also declined to give any assurance of success, and was further extremely dissatisfied with the particular sector of attack in which he was required to operate. He had not ammunition for more than 7 days' offensive battle. Nevertheless, he was quite ready, if ordered, to throw himself into it with a good heart. I visited him privately at Lancaster Gate, where he was staying for the night, and urged my opinion. He used the usual arguments about the necessity of acting in harmony with the French, and then unfolded to me the fact that General Joffre intended to employ no fewer than 40 divisions on the French sector of attack alone. Although I must admit that the tremendous scale of the operation seemed to carry the issue into the region of the unknown, I continued recalcitrant and quitted my friend in the deepest anxiety. I saw that we were confronted with the ruin of the campaign alike in the east and in the west. The decision to make a general attack in France involved the immediate starvation, or at any rate malnutrition, in ammunition and in drafts, of the army on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Although large numbers of men had to be sent thither merely to keep Sir Ian Hamilton's units in the field, this number, while enough to be a heavy loss elsewhere, was not sufficient to produce any useful results. The operations on the peninsula came to a standstill, and the Turks hastened to replace their heavy losses and reorganize their shaken and in some cases shattered formations. Meanwhile, disease and despondency were at work in our own army. The anguish of supreme success narrowly but fatally missed, the sense of being ill-supported from home, the uncertainty about the future intentions of the government, the shortage of ammunition, the threatening advent of winter, the rigorous privations of officers and men exposed the Dardanelles army to the most melancholy ordeal. The numerous and powerful opponents of the enterprise, the advocates of evacuation, the partisans of competing schemes, found themselves well supplied with all that they desired. In these depressing conditions, only the patient endurance of the British troops and the unquenchable spirit of Anzac enabled a firm posture of the army and its consequent existence to be maintained. But now a very curious incident occurred, which added greatly to the perplexities of the British government. The political power and influence of General Serrai rested upon foundations which it was not easy then precisely to define or explain. This officer, having been removed by General Joffre in July from the Verdun command in which he had distinguished himself, had obtained, through profound political influence, the command of the French troops in the Orient in succession to General Gouraud, who had been seriously wounded. Whatever dispute there might be about his military achievements, his irreligious convictions were above suspicion. There appeared to be an understanding in French governing circles that he was to be assigned an important independent role in the East, which would give him the opportunity of gathering the military laurels from which the French radical socialist elements were determined anti-clerical generals should not be debarred. Judge of our astonishment when, on September 1, in the midst of the preparations for a supreme battle in France, while our own army at the Dardanelles was cut to the barest minimum in drafts and ammunition, the Admiralty suddenly received, through the French naval attaché, the request to assist the French Ministry of Marine in dispatching from Marseille 4 new French divisions to the Dardanelles. We were then informed that the French government had decided to form a separate army of the East, of 6 divisions, which, under the command of General Serrai, would during the month of October land on the Asiatic shore of the Dardanelles and advance thence upon the forts of Jarnac in conjunction with our renewed attacks upon the Gallipoli Peninsula. We were requested to arrange for the relief of the 2 French divisions at Helles in order that, added to the 4 new French divisions from France, this separate army should be constituted for the new operation. It appeared for a space that what the most unanswerable arguments of reason, of daring, and of duty could not achieve were to be easily secured by the interplay of French political forces. For once the gloomy embarrassments of our councils were broken by the sunlight of a happy hour. We made haste to accept the French proposal. Lord Kitchener instantly promised the 2 divisions to relieve the French at Helles. Mr. Balfour began at once to gather the necessary transport. Mr. Bonar-Law joined with me in pressing the dispatch of still larger British forces, to make a good job of it. Alas for the British cabinet! They saw the truth quite clearly. They were sound and right in their general view. It was not through wrong judgment that they failed, but through want of willpower. In such times the kingdom of heaven can only be taken by storm. But then the question arose. Was it possible General Joffre could have agreed? Inquiry showed that he had agreed upon conditions. His own position was not so secure as to leave him indifferent to the pressure from the political left flank. He had been forced to maneuver. His conditions were that the reinforcing divisions for the Dardanelles were not to leave France before the main shock of his impending battle had occurred, nor until it could be seen whether its results would be decisive or not. Pressed on September 11 at Calais by Lord Kitchener as to the time which it would take to ascertain this, he stated that he would know at the end of the first week's fighting one way or the other. That if it was clear by then that a general German retreat in the west, which would have to be followed upon by every available man, was not going to be compelled, or the troops assigned to the Dardanelles would be released. October 10 was the date fixed for the embarkation of the leading divisions. It was noticed, however, that General Serrai, instead of hurrying out to the Dardanelles to survey the situation on the spot and perfect his plans, as Lord Kitchener strongly pressed him to do, preferred to remain in Paris attending to matters which were doubtless of importance. I expressed myself on this situation as follows. September 21, 1915. First. At present we are waiting for the result of the battle in France before coming to any decision about the Dardanelles. But surely we ought to make up our minds and make our plans on the assumption that no fundamental change takes place on the French front, and all preliminary action necessary to another great effort at the Dardanelles ought to be taken. For instance, it is understood that Lord Kitchener and General Joffre propose that, unless there is a decisive victory in France, 2 British and 4 French divisions shall begin to embark about October 10 for the Dardanelles. We ought now to settle if this will be enough to ensure success, and we ought now to be preparing whatever more is needed. From October 10 to the middle of November, all transports will be fully occupied in carrying the 6 above-mentioned divisions. If more are needed, either they must start now, or else the new attack at the Dardanelles will have to wait 3 or 4 weeks more till they all arrive, thus pushing the operations into the 3rd week of December. Owing to deep differences of opinion about whether the Dardanelles enterprise should be pushed through or abandoned, it is very difficult even to discuss these questions, and consequently, when there is a fair excuse like the battle pending in France, they are simply allowed to slumber. Meanwhile, the vital days are slipping away. Second, it is imperative that we should come to a decision on the main issue, and thereafter act as a united body. Up to now the opposition to the enterprise has never been strong enough to prevent each step being taken, but the friction has been so great that each step has been taken too late. Are we now going to do the same thing a 4th time on the largest scale of all? Third, by the 12th of August, we knew that the Anzac-Suvla attack had not succeeded. It is now the 21st of September. about 50,000 drafts and reinforcements have been sent, that is, not enough to make any difference, except for clinging on. Otherwise no action, no decision, no plan. Meanwhile the Turks are gathering their remaining strength. The Germans are threatening to march down, and the winter is approaching. Of course, the battle in France is at present the dominant factor. I do not attempt to go back on that. But I beseech my colleagues to take now all necessary decisions and all subsidiary and preliminary steps, so that when the result of the French offensive is manifest, action at the Dardanelles, if decided on, can proceed with the utmost speed and ample strength. Fourth, a plan should be made by the General Staff with estimates of all the troops, guns and ammunition necessary to ensure success. A date should be fixed before the end of November by which all must be concentrated ready for attack. Everything should be worked up to that date. That is, if necessary, 2 divisions should start from England now on the chance of the rest going later, so as not to block the transports after the 10th of October. They can wait in Egypt and can come back if it is subsequently decided not to make another attempt. As the armies at the Dardanelles will be greatly increased and a new landing place is probable, the additional small craft must be got ready and sent out. Not a day should be lost in this. Ammunition should be accumulated for a Dardanelles attack the moment the fate of the French offensive is decided. Unless all these plans are worked out now and the necessary steps taken, an immense delay will be caused when the final decision is taken. Are we going to wait another 3 weeks before even beginning? Winston S. Churchill. The impossibility of procuring adequate supplies of high-explosive shell in time for the battles on the peninsula had led me during July and August to search for a substitute which could be quickly manufactured. I conceived that this would be provided by masses of bombs fired from the Stokes gun, which brilliant invention had been shown to Mr. Lloyd George and me in June, and of which the Minister of Munitions had, without reference to the War Office, already ordered 1,000. September 24, 1915. I have for some time past been deeply impressed with the possibilities of attacking trenches at close quarters, under cover and by means of hurricanes of vertically dropping bombs, discharged from short-range engines, and after obtaining Lord Kitchener's approval, I have consulted with the various authorities concerned. In the Stokes gun, we have a weapon of extraordinary simplicity and cheapness, practically noiseless and flashless, and so light and mobile that it can be carried by one man. The 2 great advantages to be derived from this method of attack are, first, the intimacy of the support afforded to our assaulting infantry, as fire can be continued until they are within 50 yards of the enemy's trenches. Secondly, the possibility of obtaining immense supplies of high-explosive bombs of simple manufacture far sooner than a proportionate delivery of much more complicated high-explosive artillery shell could be obtained. All the ideas on which this scheme rests have come from officers who have been themselves constantly engaged in trench warfare. In order to give a fair chance to such a method of attack, it is necessary that it should not be attempted until it can be applied on a very large scale. To send out these guns by scores and dozens and disperse them among infantry battalions in the trenches is not to give the plan a fair opportunity. What is necessary is a regular corps of trained men who have every necessary appliance, know exactly how to handle the weapon, and have thought out all the details of their combination. 1,000 Stokes guns were ordered 2 months ago by the Minister of Munitions. Footnote, actually Mr. Lloyd George. End of footnote. On his own responsibility. and I believe it would be possible to bring 200 of them simultaneously into action, with a large supply of ammunition about the middle of November next. This mode of attack would appear to be particularly suited to the Gallipoli Peninsula, as the up and down nature of the country makes it almost impossible for artillery to search the ground thoroughly. The experiment should be tried on a great scale with 200 guns, either on the enemy's lines at Cape Helles or on his positions at Sari Bair. Winston S. Churchill. On September 20, the sinister news reached London that a Bulgarian mobilization was imminent and that Bulgaria was believed to have committed herself definitely to the Central Powers. On the next day, the Bulgarian Prime Minister told a meeting of his followers that the cause of the Allies was lost, that Bulgaria must not attach herself to the losing side, that the Quadruple Alliance had only made vague proposals to Bulgaria about the occupation of the uncontested zone after the war, and that if Bulgaria went to war, she was assured of the neutrality of Romania. At midnight on the 22nd, the Turks signed an agreement ceding the Dediagach railway to Bulgaria, and that same day Serbia signaled with alarm the increasing movement of Austro-German forces towards her northern frontier. The long-dreaded southward thrust was about to begin. It is significant that, while Bulgaria had patiently awaited the result of the Battle of Suvla Bay before taking her ghastly plunge, her rulers did not hesitate to commit themselves on the eve of the far larger battle which was known to be impending in France. The Germans could not fail to note the massing of guns and troops in Artois and Champagne, and had in fact made all preparations to receive the shock. But their confidence in the result was shared by the Bulgarian General Staff. At dawn on September 26, the great battle in the west began. It comprised a subsidiary attack by about 30 British and French divisions at Loos, and a main attack by 40 French divisions in Champagne. Sir John French had been compelled, in order to combine with the French, to accept a sphere of attack against his better judgment. But having agreed to conform to General Joffre's plan, he threw himself into the execution with his customary determination. The French attack in Champagne has since been described as the unlimited method. That is, the armies were hurled on to advance as far as they could into the blue, in the confident expectation that they would carry not merely the front systems, which had been subjected to bombardment, but all interact positions and defenses likely to be met with in the rear. In the absurd misconceptions of the staff, large masses of cavalry were brought up to press the victory to a decisive conclusion. At the fatal signal, the brave armies marched into the firestorm. The ardor of the French infantry was not unmatched by their British comrades. The issue, however, was never in doubt. The German calculations of the strength of their front and of the numbers of troops needed to defend it were accurate and sound. Their drive against Russia, their project against the Balkans, proceeded unchecked. In the first week, the Anglo-French attack had secured slight advances of no strategic significance at various points, a few score of guns and a few thousand prisoners, at the expense of more than 300,000 casualties. The time had now come for General Joffre to release the troops for the east, but he was naturally reluctant to admit defeat. The downfall of his hopes was concealed by a continuance of the fighting, and the departure of the Dardanelles divisions receded week by week. Meanwhile, the winter season steadily approached the army on the peninsula, and the catastrophe of the Balkans arrived. On September 25, the general mobilization of the Bulgarian army had begun. Those who placed reliance and the optimistic accounts of the fighting in France, which were supplied by the military authorities here and in France, found it impossible to believe that the Germans, faced by such formidable assaults in the west and extended in immense operations in the east, could spare a new army to conquer Serbia, and they therefore continued incredulous to the last. During the 3rd and 4th weeks of September, the concentration of considerable Austro-German forces north of the Danube became unmistakable. On October 4, our intelligence reported the presence of Mackensen at Temesvar. Belated and frantic efforts to deter the Bulgarians, exhausting the whole apparatus of promises and threats, were received with sullen impassivity, and the mobilization of the Bulgarian armies proceeded regularly. King Ferdinand pursued his profoundly considered and most perilous policy with mechanical precision. An iron discipline gripped the peasant soldiers, and a ruthless suppression quelled the parliamentary forces. Serbia, unreasonable to the last, prepared to meet her doom with passionate appeals to her allies and dauntless heroism in the field. The repercussion of these events must now be studied. The only power which could come to the aid of Serbia before it was too late was Greece. Accordingly, at last, an earnest and united effort was made by all the allies to procure the entry of Greece into the general war. Twice she had placed herself at their disposal. Twice she had been rebuffed. Now it was the turn of the allies to ask. By treaty, Greece was obliged to aid Serbia against a Bulgarian attack. King Constantine and the Greece that followed him claimed that this treaty did not apply to a war in which Serbia was attacked not only by Bulgaria, but by a great power. Serbia invoked the treaty, demanded the support of Greece, and also appealed to the Allies for 150,000 men. Monsieur Venizelos, again Prime Minister and at the head of a parliamentary majority fresh from elections, urged the Allies to send troops to Salonika to enable Greece to enter the war according to her honorable obligations. As a military measure to aid Serbia directly, the landing at this juncture of Allied forces at Salonika was absurd. The hostile armies concentrating on the eastern and northern frontiers of Serbia were certain to overwhelm and overrun that country before any effective aid, other than Greek aid, could possibly arrive. As a political move to encourage and determine the action of Greece, the dispatch of Allied troops to Salonika was justified. But the question arose, where were the troops to come from? Obviously from the Dardanelles, and only from the Dardanelles. A French and a British division, all that could be spared and all that could get to Salonika in time, were accordingly taken from Sir Ian Hamilton's hard-pressed army in the closing days of September. The reader who has a true sense of the values in the problem will not be surprised to learn that this dispatch of troops from the Dardanelles produced the opposite effect to that intended or desired. King Constantine had been trained all his life as a soldier. He had studied very closely the strategic situation of his country and conceived himself to be an authority on the subject. The road to his heart was through some sound military plan, and this he was never offered by the Allies. When he learned that the Allied help was to take the form of withdrawing 2 divisions from the Dardanelles, he naturally concluded that that enterprise was about to be abandoned. He saw himself, if he entered the war, confronted after a short interval not only with the Bulgarians, but with the main body of the Turkish army, now chained to the Gallipoli Peninsula. He read in the British and French action a plain confession of impending failure in the main operation, whose progress during the whole year had dominated the war situation in the East. It proved impossible to remove these anxieties from the royal mind and add it to his German sympathies. They were decisive. His Majesty, said Sir Francis Eliot on October 6, was disturbed by the fact that troops had been brought from the Dardanelles to Salonika. He thought that it was the beginning of the abandonment of the expedition and would release the whole Turkish army to reinforce the Bulgarians. While the troops were already on the way and the British Navy were netting the harbour of Salonika against submarines, King Constantine dismissed Monsieur Venizelos, on whose invitation they had come. The Allies therefore found themselves confronted with a pro-German Greece determined to repudiate its treaty obligations to Serbia. Thus the object of the expedition to Salonika had entirely disappeared. But those powerful persons in France and England who had advocated it were determined to persevere. The miseries of Serbia fighting desperately against superior forces, the shame and sorrow of watching a small ally trampled down, combined with dislike and wariness of the Dardanelles, to form a tide of opinion impossible to resist. I continued to point to the Dardanelles as the master key to the problem, and to a naval attempt to force the Straits as the sole chance of changing the action of Bulgaria and averting the destruction of Serbia. Even up to the last moment, the arrival of a British fleet in the Sea of Marmara might have transformed the situation. The Bulgarians, having mobilized against one side, might have marched against the other. On October 6, I made my last attempt with Mr. Balfour. Mr. Churchill to Mr. Balfour, October 6, 1915. I must revert again to the question of the renewal of the naval attack on the Narrows. You should not overlook the fact that Admiral de Robeck is deeply committed against this by what has taken place, and his resolution and courage, which in other matters are beyond dispute, are in this case prejudiced by the line he has taken since the beginning. Could he have foreseen after the 18th of March the terrible course and vast expansion of the military operations, it is inconceivable that he would not have renewed the attack. But in those days the loss of 4,000 or 5,000 men was the most that was expected, and a swift victory was counted upon. Since then, probably 150,000 French and British troops have been killed or wounded on the peninsula. The admiral is therefore in a very difficult position. The naval attack is admittedly a great hazard. If it fails, there is a heavy loss. If it succeeds, he would be stultified. Is it not natural that in these circumstances his opposition to it should be deep-seated? I notice the complaints which he makes about the steering capacity of the monitors. If these are well founded, it would be necessary to use battleships. These could be protected against underwater damage by a variety of methods. The presence of even a few ships in the Marmara would absolutely cut off the Turkish army and relieve us of all our difficulties. I believe we have been all these months in the position of the Spanish prisoner who languished for 20 years in a dungeon until one morning the idea struck him to push the door, which had been open all the time. Mr. Balfour, however, although perfectly ready to bear the supreme responsibility if Admiral de Robeck and the First Sea Lord, Sir Henry Jackson, had been willing to make the attempt, could not feel justified in overriding them or replacing them by others. It only remained, therefore, to await the catastrophe. The cabinet found the hopelessness of the situation unendurable, and apparently the French government was similarly distressed. A vehement wish to rush troops to the aid of Serbia manifested itself. It was in vain that the impossibility of their arriving before it was too late was explained. On Friday, October 6, after heated and confused discussions, the cabinet decided to refer the tangled situation to the considered judgment of the combined staffs of the Admiralty and the War Office. The great question: what to do? was accordingly remitted to the naval and military experts gathered together under the guidance of the Chief of the Imperial General Staff and the First Sea Lord. Through the whole of Saturday and Sunday these officers considered and prepared their report, and on Monday, October 9, this remarkable document was circulated to ministers. The General Staff, in loyal accord with General Headquarters in France and with almost all orthodox military opinion, recommended that everything should be concentrated on the prolongation of the Battle of Loos, from which they considered decisive results might be obtained. In this they were proved wrong by the events not only of 1915, but of 1916 and of 1917. Although the British Army continued its operations with the fullest support and to the utmost limit of its ammunition, not only were they unable to break the German line, but a very large proportion of their initial gains were wrested from them by the German counterattacks. If Sir Douglas Haig, with the enormous expenditure of munitions and life which characterized the battles on the Somme in 1916 or Passchendaele in 1917, was unable to achieve any decisive results, what chance had Sir John French with the scanty offensive resources of 1915? The best and most orthodox military opinion was at this time so far out of touch with reality that the General Staff still contemplated the eruption of a mass of cavalry through the German line. What the cavalry would have done if they had got through was not explained. But passing from the general question of the offensive in France to the specific issues raised by the situation in the East, the General Staff of the Army and the Admiralty War Staff pronounced in no uncertain tones against the Salonika enterprise and in favor of a continuance of the operations at the Dardanelles. The advocates of Salonika had been those who had pressed most strongly for the remission of the disputed questions to be unbiased and undiluted judgment of the naval and military experts. They were completely indisposed to accept the pronouncement of the tribunal to which they had appealed. When these matters came before the War Council, whose numbers had now been increased to include the prominent figures on both sides of the controversy, on the evening of October 9, it was evident that no agreement could be reached as between Salonika and the Dardanelles. On the other hand, it was common ground that large reinforcements should be sent to the Eastern Theatre as soon as possible. As these troop movements would necessarily take several weeks, and it could be plausibly argued that the situation would develop in the meanwhile in such a way as to make ultimate concord possible, it was firmly settled that 6 divisions should be withdrawn from France and sent to Egypt, and that what should happen to them after that should be settled later. The Prime Minister felt himself constrained to agree to this arrangement. He was, in my opinion, throughout unwavering in his intention to persevere at the Dardanelles, and he used every resource of patience and tact to guide and carry opinion in that direction and to secure the necessary decisions at the earliest possible moment. A more vigorous course would probably have broken up the government. I was and am strongly of opinion that it would have been much better to break up the cabinet and let one section or the other carry out their view in its integrity, than to preserve what was called the national unity at the expense of vital executive action. But after that, there would still have been the difficulty with the French. The French government had by this time made up their mind wholeheartedly in favor of Salonika. They declared their intention of sending General Serrai's army thither instead of to the Dardanelles, and urged us to support them as strongly as possible. Another series of disputes therefore broke out in the cabinet upon the proposal to divert to Salonika the troops now under orders for Egypt, and the consequent abandonment of any further great enterprise to open the straits. Military authority was again appealed to, and the General Staff, in a paper, every word of which was justified by subsequent events, showed that there was no possibility of saving the Serbians, and that the Salonika enterprise was a dangerous and futile dissipation and misdirection of forces. Fortified by the unequivocal recommendations of all the military and naval authorities, the cabinet refused to agree to the French proposals, and insisted upon in reinforcing British divisions being sent according to the agreement to Egypt, where they were to be fitted out with their semi-tropical equipment, etc. On this, General Joffre was sent by the French government over to England. After his defeat in Champagne, he was in no position to resist the strong tendencies of his government, nor possibly particularly anxious to keep General Serrai in Paris. He arrived and, in the absence of the Prime Minister, who was at this time temporarily incapacitated by illness, met the leading members of the cabinet. I was excluded from this conference, no doubt because it was known that I should certainly prove intractable. After the conference was over, the cabinet was informed that General Joffre had pledged his military judgment in favor of the necessity and practicability of the Salonika expedition, and had threatened to resign the command of the French armies if the British did not effectively cooperate. In spite of the strenuous resistance of the British General Staff and in the flattest defiance of their advice, the cabinet yielded to this outrageous threat. The final policy of the British government, though erroneous in direction and too late in time, was not without its grandeur. On October 12, the following declaration was made both to Romania and to Greece. The only effective manner in which help can be given to Serbia is by the immediate declaration of war by Romania and Greece against the Austro-Germans and Bulgaria. The British government in that event would be prepared to sign forthwith a military convention with Romania, whereby Great Britain will guarantee to bring into action in the Balkan theatre, not including the forces already in Gallipoli, an army of at least 200,000 men. If the French sent a force, as they contemplate doing, that force would be part of this total. But if not, the British government would undertake to provide the whole number themselves. This force would include a number of our best and most seasoned divisions, and we shall maintain them in the field, waging war on behalf of our allies until the objective is accomplished. A steady flow of troops will commence as soon as transport is available and will be continuously maintained. We estimate that 150,000 men will be available by the end of November, and the total, 200,000, will be reached by the end of the year. The military convention will state precisely the dates at which the different portions of the army will arrive. We are repeating this offer to Greece, and if Romania is prepared to act immediately, we shall call upon Greece imperatively to fulfill her treaty obligations to Serbia. Such a spirit, manifested 3 months earlier, would have prevented the disasters by whose imminence it had been evoked. Such an army applied in August or September, either to the Gallipoli Peninsula or to the Asiatic shore, would have overpowered the Turks already extended at their fullest strain, and transformed defeat into victory throughout the East. But now these immense offers, not arising from foresight, but extorted only by the pressure of events, fell upon deaf ears. Neither Romania nor Greece would move an inch. In these throes Sir Edward Carson resigned because of the failure to rescue Serbia, and Monsieur Delcassé because of the attempt. On October 9, the storm of ruin burst upon the Balkans, and Mackensen, crossing the Danube with 9 German and Austrian divisions, entered Belgrade from the north. 2 days later, the Bulgarians invaded Serbia from the east. This double and converging attack was overwhelming. Uskup fell on October 22 and Niš on November 2. In another month, Monastir was captured, and by the middle of December the Serbian army was destroyed or driven completely from Serbian soil. The relentless severity of the Bulgarian pursuit exposed the retreating Serbian forces and population to the worst horrors of war and winter. Scores of thousands of defenseless people perished, and the whole country was ravaged and reduced to complete subjugation. Meanwhile, large Anglo-French forces began to accumulate at Salonika as helpless spectators of these events. The Allied army on the Gallipoli Peninsula was left to rot, and the British fleet at the Dardanelles remained motionless.